Hello, and thank you for joining Hudson Institute for today's conversation on Peru's strategic moment. My name is Daniel Batlle, and I'm an adjunct fellow at Hudson Institute. On Monday, President Dina Boluarte delivered her final State of the Union address, promising continuity through the end of her term next year. So this is a timely moment to have this discussion on the strategic choices ahead for Peru. I'm pleased to welcome a very distinguished group of speakers today. It is a special honor to have Peruvian scholar and politician Francisco Tudela, who has served Peru in a variety of roles, including as a member of Congress, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as a first vice president. Ambassador Hugo de Sela is a retired career ambassador with over 40 years of diplomatic service, held several important assignments, including ambassador to the United States from 2019 to 2021. Diego de la Torre is a businessman and leader in Peru's private sector. He's chairman of construction supply company La Viga and Quikrete Peru. And lastly, Mark Wachtenheim is an American observer of Latin America and U.S. Latin American relations, who's been based in Lima the last few years. And I want to start with Mark to set the scene for this discussion. Mark, given your experience around the region and in Peru, what is at stake in the strategic choices that Peru faces?
Thanks very much, Dan, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for convening this panel at a moment that I think, like the title suggests, in every sense is strategic for Peru. In Washington, as you know, Dan, we often discuss Latin America through the lens of crisis. Focusing on migration, on corruption, governance challenges, political instability. And all of these are present in the case of Peru. And they're also frequently present in the international headlines on what's taking place in Peru. But what we're seeing here, and I've spent, like you rightly point out, a great part of the last couple of years on the ground. I wouldn't say I've traversed the whole country. It's a large and very diverse country, but I've traveled some within the country, and I've spoken to people from all walks of life. And we don't see instability in the sense of daily chaos. It's more something that I would refer to as strategic drift, where power is fragmented, institutions are inertial, and something which we don't frequently discuss, and I don't know that we have the vocabulary yet developed or the grammar to identify properly even what it is that's at play is and what the stakes are, is an erosion in some cases of sovereignty, where it's bargained not through a revolution, not through people showing up wearing red berets, but too often people wearing business suits. And for me, this is a much more helpful lens to analyze some of the deeper forces that are at play in Peru, and not just in Peru. I would say that Peru is a lens or a litmus test, an emblematic for what we can observe in many countries in the region. And that's part of why I think that this panel is so important to hold now. Now, at the same time, you pointed out the president's State of the Union speech that was just a couple of days ago. I would say that we're also witnessing a very interesting phenomenon, which is what I would call a reawakening of a sovereign instinct or a sovereign reflex. When the president was heckled by congressmen of the left, and let's remember, President Boluarte is herself of the left. Her ad lib was one of suggesting that Peru will not go the way of the failed states, Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia. This was also a veiled critique of the overreach by these countries in trying to discredit and undermine the legitimacy of her government, which took place at the beginning of her government and may still be taking place today. So we see this in a number of ways as well. Over about 48 hours prior to that, Peru's Ministry of Justice in a communique rejected a decision by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, reasserting the principle of the primacy of its constitution and its laws over constitutional order in the country. And we have seen other examples like this. A couple of weeks ago, when China and Brazil jointly mentioned plans to construct a transcontinental railroad that would traverse Peru and connect western Brazil to the port of Chancay. The reaction of the Peruvian government was to reject this and say that they were not consulted, they were not part of the dialogue, and that this was an incursion on a conversation that Peru would have needed to have been involved in. And we see other examples of this, like a Peruvian government regulator in charge of regulating over ports and transportation, finding itself defending in court its right under Peruvian law to regulate a regulee, in this case, the Chinese owner of the port of Chancay. So while this is not yet a doctrine, it's not yet a strategy, I would say that it points to a new phenomenon, which is an awakening of this, what I've labeled a sovereign instinct or a sovereign reflex. And it's important that this is from a government that is of the left, and these are not populist slogans, they're not nationalistic outbursts, they're signals. I would say that this is important today, not just because of what's taking place in Peru. This is not just about turmoil within the country or its economic fundamentals, but it's about a tectonic shift that's taking place in the world center of gravity from the Atlantic theater to the Pacific theater. And Peru is now positioned at a hinge point in our region. Now, all of this is coinciding with an imminent arrival by a new U.S. ambassador to Peru, a political appointee from the highest levels of Senator Rubio's circle. And I think that matters. It also signals on the part of the United States the possibility of a reset, not of diplomatic style, but of a new strategic posture. And coming back to the purpose of the panel, I hope that this will serve not about as an opportunity to prescribe from above, from a think tank, but to illuminate a trend and identify that trend of something that's already taking place. And I'm very happy to be joined by Ambassador de Sela, who's one of the country's most seasoned foreign policy minds, and by Foreign Minister Tudela, who grasps global tectonics better than anyone, and also by Diego de la Torre, who's championed Peru that's rooted in Western values and the free institutions, and understands the role that capital plays, beyond capital as a transmitter of values. And I'm proud also to call them all friends. So I think that they'll all, from their different perspectives, provide insights into what new potential strategic alignments are possible between the United States and Peru. I'd say that that's what Peru's strategic moment is. I think that's the strategic horizon, and hopefully, by the end, we will have a closer view of that horizon. Thanks very much again, Dan, and thanks for having invited me to participate in the panel.
Well, thank you, Mark. I think that's an excellent starting point for this discussion. I want to go to Foreign Minister Tudela. With your, as Mark said, your grasp of global tectonics, can you talk about Peru's strategic posture, both within the region and within the broader Pacific world? And along with that, what are the challenges that come with Peru's evolving posture?
I would say that the strategic position of Peru is not aligned at this moment with, let's say, the Sao Paulo Forum or the will of emerging powers to create a new currency in the world. Traditionally, Peru is in the Western historic world and wishes, that's my impression, to stay there. But as there is a political crisis and has been instability in the last 5 or 6 years, there is a tendency to see the tree and not the forest. That is, to see the crisis, to see the politics, and not to see the country. In fact, the strategic choice is very simple. You are an open, sovereign society, or you are a closed, dependent society that is linked to the Foro Sao Paulo and emerging powers outside the Americas. So that's essentially the choice. It's not a thing of a multitude of options. There are only two options. Why Peru matters to the Western Hemisphere? First, it's the third largest country in Latin America. It's the size of Spain, France, and maybe Germany together. And it has 498,225 square miles. It's 4.5 times the size of Ecuador, to give you an idea. 34.4 million people in the Pacific Coast. The Pacific Coast has acquired a huge importance in the 20th century because industrial hubs are in the Pacific, in the Northern Pacific mainly. The policy and the strategy of the US in the 20th century was Atlantic-centric. Now, by necessity, it has to be Pacific-centric due to the displacement of the industrial and economic hubs. Then Peru has 5 boundaries. What happens in Peru affects its neighbors. We have boundaries with Ecuador, with Colombia, with Brazil, with Bolivia, and Chile. And the country has a prominent economic situation. That has to be taken into account. We are the second largest fishing nation in the world, globally, in fisheries. We are the first in agribusiness in the Pacific coast of South America. We have a network of 20 ports, of which Callao, Paita, Matarani, and now Salaverry and Chancay are the main ones. The largest Amazonic rainforest in South America, access to the vital sea lanes to Asia, America, Oceania, and to the Austral Belt sea lanes. That's Chile, New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, and Cape Town. And it's the second copper producer and reserves in the world, one of the 3 most richest polymetallic mountain ranges in the world, with the South African Rand and the Urals in Russia. So that's what is at stake for the Western Hemisphere on the vis-à-vis the political future of Peru. We'll have elections on 2026, but the entity of Peru is important. Its strategic importance cannot be understated. We have to understand that Peru is a strategic rearguard of the East Asian American foreign policy and its security alliance of what's called the Indo-Pacific strategy. That is due to the fact that we have a huge coastline and ports of 1,913 miles. Of course, that is of interest to China, that has built a private port, that is Chancay, that is now the object of controversy. We have mostly bilateral trade with the US, with China. China is the main commercial partner of Peru with the European Union, but there is an exception. We are linked to Chile. Chile has invested in Peru more than $6 billion US dollars in the last year. And Peru has a lesser but strong investment than Chile. So these two countries are linked in their destiny. In general, foreign investment, to give you an idea, has been of 2,923 million US dollars in the first quarter of 2025. So Peru is a big player in the region. If Peru, let's say, fails, its democracy fails, its institution fails, it's not a small island in the Pacific. It means that it will affect everyone in the hemisphere. It's an objective that the Foro de Sao Paulo wants to attain, to conquer power in Peru. Brazil, Lula is the leader of the Foro de Sao Paulo, has made this agreement with China, showed interest in making studies for a bioceanic railroad. That, in fact, shows the value of Peru to make a bioceanic railroad from the coast of Brazil to the port of Chancay in Peru. We are talking here of a huge project. Peru has political problems, and with this I will finish. It has a very stable economy, absolute economic freedom guaranteed by the 1993 Constitution in a special chapter, 3% annual growth, according to the IMF, 1.69% inflation. It has the strongest currency in Latin America. It's a working democracy, even if with its setbacks. It has been able to confront challenges against democracy and overcome them. And the crisis is, let's say, by example, in the judiciary. It was mentioned, this communiqué vis-à-vis the interference of the court, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And that is because the judiciary is in crisis. Some courts even rebel against laws that have been passed by Congress because they are not ideologically compatible with the judges. This is absurd. The law is the law, it has to be applied unless a constitutional court rules otherwise. So that is a big problem. There is this intrusion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that is linked to the Foro de Sao Paulo. Then the nation's prosecutor's office is in disarray. There is also a wave of international crime that not only affects Peru. This wave came with the migration from Venezuela, and it affects Ecuador, it affects Peru. I have just been in Chile. It affects Chile with the same intensity as Peru. But as Peru is a more wealthy country and vast country, of course, this criminality has concentrated its efforts in Peru. This is linked to drug trafficking, to extortion, to illegal mining, etc. We have 1.7 million Venezuelans in Peru, mostly got into the country without being, in fact, processed. They just showed their IDs and were let in. Of course, you have fantastic people that are very good professionals, that are really people that help Peru in different fields of knowledge, but at the same time, you have the Tren de Aragua and the criminal organizations that President Trump has denounced. And I think that they should receive a legal treatment as that has been given in the US through executive orders. The Foro de Sao Paulo acts through political parties that are close to those criminal organizations. Even the party of Pedro Castillo was linked to the shining path called the militarized shining path, that in fact is a drug trafficking organization now, and it's linked to the Cartel Vermelho, to the Tren de Aragua, and all these organizations. So these parties that want to break up the link of Peru with the West are linked themselves with these criminal organizations. And the solutions. Well, the solutions, I think, are visible to everyone. There is the will of Peru to remain an open and sovereign society, open to investment from the world. That doesn't mean we will exclude Chinese investments or American investments or European investments, but it means that there should not be privileges for one of those investors in particular. At the same time, we have to reinforce the constitutional authority of the executive to confront criminality and subversion. And that means several reforms in the field of the tax authorities, in the field of police action, and even the armed forces, as in the case of Ecuador. Then we must reduce the state. We reformed the state in the 1990s under the idea of the Washington Consensus. It was very successful, but then subsequent governments from 2000 onwards have been creating this regulatory jungle. We have to get through that jungle. We have to wipe out that jungle and make our economy even more dynamic to reach at least 5% of annual growth under the present conditions. So that's an objective. We have to reduce the state. Bureaucracy has multiplied itself again. And that is a huge problem because we don't know the number of bureaucrats that exist in Peru. The usual number was 1,250,000, but people who know that that number is from the 1990s, the end of the 1990s, and people who have studied the problem had made a calculation that between the central government of Peru and the regional governments and the municipal governments, we might be around 2,500,000 or even 3 million bureaucrats. That is 10% of the population. That's more than what Peru can pay. Most of the foreign debt is used for current expenses of the state, so it goes away in wages, in salaries, and that has to be stopped because we have to invest in projects more than to invest in bureaucracy. And then we need a constitutional reform because under the presidency of President Vizcarra, a constitutional reform was imposed over Congress, by which the reforms created the pandemonium we are living now, in which we have 43 candidates for the presidency of the Republic. The end product of that reform was to destroy the political parties that existed up to that moment, fracture Peruvian politics, and we need a constitutional reform to rebuild our electoral system and political parties. And we have to deregulate us in the 1990s. So that poses a very clear choice. If we want to do this, we have to be with those countries that belong to open societies. We have to be linked with democratic institutions, with free countries that are pro-free trade and international commerce, democratic values, and human rights. If we don't want these reforms, we'll end opting for closed societies. And those closed societies will be dependent on institutions. This is a kind of new socialist international in the world that is the Foro de Sao Paulo, and behind them emerging powers, let's say like China, like Russia, that are interested in changing the rules of the game to get a privileged access to the wealth of Peru that is huge. Because let's be realistic, in the 21st century, it's less about ideology in the sense of the 20th century, and it's more about having a privileged position and preponderance in different continents of the world for economic reasons.
Thank you.
So I say that those are the two choices that confront Peru.
Okay.
And
thank you,
that's
Minister. Those
what
are
I have to say.
compelling points. I want to go to Ambassador De Sela. Ambassador, as someone who's been part of the foreign policy establishment in Peru, and ambassador here in the United States, how do you view this moment? And connected to that, how do you view this moment in U.S.-Peru relations?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Let me begin my comments by looking at the neighborhood landscape in Latin America, and in particularly in South America. If you take a look, you see that in Uruguay, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, Venezuela, we have a domination of the left. We have an orientation to socialist regimes. We only have regimes from the center to the right in Paraguay, Argentina, Ecuador, and now Peru. I would say that in Peru, there has been a change that was happening in the last 2 years, but was very clearly expressed by President Boluarte in her speech a couple of days ago. She said very clearly that the position she has is now that Peru belongs strongly to the Western Hemisphere, and that she respects the values that we all have in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that's important. Taking that into account, we have to recognize that, as Minister Tudela was saying, we have several problems in Peru, obviously. We are in a particularly difficult time because we are at the beginning of an electoral process with all that implies. No? And we have to begin with an absurd number of political parties and candidates. That's going to be very difficult to manage, and it's going to be complicated to solve. We have obviously political and social problems, and we have an institutional instability that weakens the country. And we have the problems we all know about violence in the streets, corruption, and so on. But at the same time, we have another reality in Peru, which is the economy reality. The economy in Peru is growing. We have monetary stability. We have a very low inflation, growing international reserves, and we are doing pretty well. Peru is an attractive country from that point of view. We have good investment opportunities. Our exports are growing, and so we are doing pretty well in that sense. Now, going to your question specifically about the relationship with the United States, I think one of the main problems is that in the States there is a lack of information about Peru. The current analysis that the political world in Washington makes about Peru is within the scope of Latin America. We have not yet get to the point in which Peru is analyzed separately. We are all a part of a conglomerate, and that makes our American friends miss several important details, I would say. For instance, let me put precise examples of this. Today in Peru, we have an important opportunity to develop our ports. The Chancay port has been mentioned extensively in the United States. Well, I have been having meetings with some American investors, with some American politicians, and so on, to tell them, yes, you keep talking about the danger of the Chancay port, the danger of the penetration of China. But for instance, we have around the Chancay port a lot of investment opportunities. We need roads, we need buildings, we need to create links for the commerce and so on. We have a lot of opportunities, but the only focus that the United States has is the danger of the port of Chancay, not the opportunities. That's what I meant when I said you are looking at the specifics. Another example. One of the main problems in Peru is the lack of infrastructure. For instance, roads, because the transportation system in my country is quite difficult. In there, you have a huge opportunity. We have been also talking with the United States about an air spaceport. That's a huge opportunity. We have ideal geographic situation. This has been studied by several experts in the US, but we keep talking and talking about the issue, but there is no action about it. We have been talking about another extremely important issue, which is the change of our military equipment. Specifically, we have been speaking about the possibility of acquiring airplanes from the United States. But the US bureaucracy takes forever in making an offer. They keep thinking, they keep studying the issue, and we keep insisting, but we were not able to get up to today a precise answer, a precise offer. What I'm trying to say is that we are not using all the opportunities that Peru has to offer to the United States. But that's within a more ample framework. We are all saying now, we are all hearing now that with the Trump government and with the Secretary of State that has Latin links, you are going to have to give more attention to the Western Hemisphere, meaning Latin America. But well, up to today, that's a very good goal, but we are not seeing too much action about it. There is a lot of conversations, a lot of intentions, but we have to put that into effect. You have to realize that there are only, as I said at the beginning, a few countries that are in a position of being close to the United States and to cooperate amply with the United States, because the other countries are in a different position. So we have to strengthen our links between the two countries. The question with China, which I think is important in this context, has not been, in my opinion, adequately understood in the United States. We have to distinguish something that is extremely important. We are a Western Hemisphere countries. Our values are values of democracy, human rights. We believe in free trade and so on. But that doesn't preclude us to make business with other countries. And the relationship we have with China is a business relationship. Why? Because they are willing to invest in the country, they are willing to trade with us, and we are not going to waste that opportunity. We have to profit from that opportunity because it's convenient for our country. But that doesn't mean that we are becoming ideologically Chinese. We are not doing that, definitely, because they have other values, other ways of organizing their society, and we are not buying that, let's say it that way. The question is that the Chinese are willing to use and to profit all and every opportunity that arises in South America. And we are still missing our American friends. We keep asking the United States to give us more attention, to take a look and see all the opportunities that we have for investment, for trade, and so on. And we are not using that. And I think that's something very important. I think that an institution like the Hudson Institute could go a long way in helping us to say these things to the Washington community. And I think an opportunity like this conversation is very useful to begin to do that. I would really much love to see that this develops in a continuous conversation to help our American friends to be aware of the opportunities in Peru.
Ambassador, thank you so much. I think this is, I think that's a really needed perspective here in Washington. I want to turn to Diego. Diego de la Torre, shifting focus to the economy, which has been a bright spot for Peru. What the ambassador has mentioned some of the opportunities for the U.S. and Peru, but what do you see as the opportunities for closer economic cooperation between the United States and Peru?
Really, thank you. I think it's a very exciting time for Peru and the Peru-U.S. relationship. As I always tell and talk to Francisco Tudela and Hugo de Sela, Peru is kind of the Cinderella of the Western world that has to be discovered. It's very pretty. It has some dirt clothes that has to be cleaned. I mean, the corruption, but it lacks some infrastructure. I mean, good food, no? And Peru is really very important that it strengthens the relationship with the U.S. It has a very strong economy. We have investment grade. And also something very important that in 2007, we signed a free trade agreement. I call the second generation free trade agreement, that it includes labor standards and some environmental standards. It's not like the NAFTA in the 90s, that it was actually very asymmetric. I mean, the Mexicans could have at that time even child labor. No, but the free trade agreement signed by Peru included that it was a second generation one, and Peru is really has a lot of potential. We have a growing, vibrant, very entrepreneurial middle class that are willing to do business, and they don't depend on the state because about 60% of the economy is informal, which is actually a fancy euphemism for illegal economy. No? That's a big challenge in Peru, to formalize the economy. And one of the big issue to be addressed in Peru is increasing what I call the Frankenstein regulation, no? That regulation that strangle private initiatives. There are a lot of steps that are being taken in that respect by the current government. And in that sense, I see this is a very exciting time. It's going to be 250 anniversary of the independence of the US next year in 2026, and also 200 years of the start of the relationship between Peru and the USA. No, as Ambassador De Sela and Dr. Tudela was saying, it's very important that Peru and in general Hispanic America to be rediscovered as a strong ally, because we belong to the Western world. We have the same alphabet. We have the same cultural values. We have even the same moral compass that has been driven by Christianity. No, and it's not a coincidence. I would say that Pope Leo XIV is American and also Peruvian by choice. No, and as I think it was the thinker, writer Anatole France who said, coincidence is when God wants to do something and not to put his signature there. I mean, I'm a believer. Well, I'm part of the Western world, Christian world. I think all the stars are aligned that our region start to a path to become a first world mestizo Hispanic bloc. No, we have everything to, well, in the 16th century, I would say 17th century and 18th century, we were part of the Spanish Empire. No, and for example, even in the 18th century, it was Bernardo de Galvez, who was governor of Louisiana, who helped the American independence, no, in the Battle of Pensacola. So I would say we have to, the U.S. and Hispanic America and Peru, and particularly the U.S. The U.S. has a very strong, of course, Anglo-Saxon heritage, is the most important heritage they have, but they also have Hispanic heritage. No, you can see all the west of the U.S. You just see the names, no, California, Los Angeles, San Antonio, Texas, and they share with the Anglo-Saxon world the rule of law, Christianity, and I would say the most important thing is the moral compass. No, and going to as we were discussing, there has been some neglect in both sides, a lack of understanding between the two countries and regions, and it has to be reinvigorated, no? And because I think is the way to go, no? And regarding China, Peru has an advantage in that sense because we don't have debt with China. We have our debt GDP ratio is about 32%, and it's not the case, for example, of Bolivia, Argentina, Ecuador, and Venezuela, countries that are highly indebted with a large debt to China. In that sense, they can put some pressure to those countries. Peru is not the case. So we are in, as Mark was highlighting at the beginning, we have regained some sovereign space, no? And also one thing that I would like to emphasize is Peruvians. I remember like 30 years ago when I was studying in England, my British friends defined Peru, no, described Peru as 10 seconds of the BBC per year if there was a bomb. That was the definition, no? Because it was a lack of knowledge. But now I would say Peru have the GDP has grown 3 1.5 times in
Oh,
the
nice.
last 30 years. Our GDP per capita is almost the same that the one in China, no? And the most important thing, there is a change in the cultural mindset in Peru. I used to be also a university professor as well as a businessman. And 30 years ago, my students used to say, I'm going to be successful despite being Peruvian. But now they have learned the real history and they are regain pride and trust in their own culture. And now they say, I'm going to be successful because I am Peruvian. And that's huge. No? And also one characteristic of Peru that is very similar to the US is a foreign national who comes here, he can become a Peruvian. We even have a Japanese of first generation who was even a president. No, it's the same like in America. A Japanese, a Chinese, a Peruvian goes to the States, and they can become an American because it's a loyalty to some ideals and the Constitution, the values of freedom, no, and free enterprise, property rights, no, and in that sense, we're very similar. We welcome foreign investments, of course, subject to our rule of law. No,
Diego,
yeah.
I want to follow up with you on that last point about how Peru is capable of assimilating people from abroad. You know, one of the factors that we see in Peru and elsewhere in the region is a very sudden influx of migrants. So could you speak very briefly, because we're running out of time, about the big picture implications of the dramatic migration that we've seen in just the last few years? What does it mean for Peru?
Well, as Dr. Tudela was saying, actually, that's something that has to be addressed. No, we welcome immigration, but legal migration, and I would say that we have to make an immigration system that is a clever one, like the one they have in Australia, with by points, no? And no, because to welcome everybody, it becomes, as you know, so the Foro de Sao Paulo has emptied the prisons and mental institutions, and they have poured that people in the US and even in Europe, and also in Peru. Maduro sent people from jails, and not all of them, of course, they are very nice people, very hardworking people, but we need to address the issue of immigration in a very serious way, a very strategic for the country, because we have the right to invite people who can add some value to our country, and not to bring, I mean, the people who are dysfunctional. No, and the ability to assimilate is very important. Even the Incas, no, the Incas took from the previous cultures the best, and without inferiority complexes. No, also the Spaniards who came here, they mixed, and even the Western world. No, the Western world took from the Greeks democracy, from the Arabs the mathematics, no, algebra, no? And from the Andean world the need to develop economic systems that are friendly to the environment. Friendly to the environment in a scientific way, not in an ideological way, because this would be my last point. I'm very excited by all these measures against some NGOs that promote division among Peruvians, trying to fragment our society between African Peruvians, Asian Peruvians, Euro Peruvians. No, we are all Peruvians. No, and that measures of the Dutch Department of Government Efficiency, that the funds of USAID be applied in a sensible way. No, not without ideological agendas, but with building partnership between the two countries and exchange of knowledge, information, culture, and not to create political divides and social fights. No, I would, and my last point, it would be very important if Marco Rubio comes to Peru, and or next year in the 200th anniversary of and our change of power in Peru comes. It would be great if President Trump could come. It will be a very strong gesture that Peru is no longer the Cinderella of the Western world.
I hope that is a prediction, Diego. Thank you very much for your comments. I want to pick up on something that Minister Tudela said about the inadequacy of reforms under President Vizcarra and the fact that constitutional reform is still needed. We don't have a lot of time, but could you speak very briefly about what you would like to see? What you would like to see that would, bring greater political stability, strengthen Peru's institutions, and so on?
Well, what I would like to see is an electoral law that is based on a nominal or binominal electoral system. That means a system more or less like the one the US or Britain or Chile have, in which you don't elect a list of candidates in bulk, so you don't know them, and they don't represent really the people that have voted for them. We have a system that has been copied from Germany, from Spain, but is not adequate to the reality of Peru. In Peru, you need personal representation. You need one representative representing, or two representatives, a whole electoral district. And so that's the first problem. The second problem is that the reform that Vizcarra made permitted or tried to permit a system in which all the population could vote on the primaries of every party. That was a system by which you could sabotage the internal elections of the different political parties. So in fact, we need a simpler system, and a system that really represents people, and to have representatives that are accountable, that have a face, that have a name, and that respond to the population. That's the first, I would say, the essential point of the electoral reform that is needed. And another point that I would like to add, because I have to leave in a few minutes, is the difference between US and, let's say, Chinese investments. The US is competing against the state-owned companies that can pay 2 times the price of something they want. The US invests in Peru in limited fields. Its American corporations are in airlines, laboratories, software, consumer goods like Coca-Cola. But the Chinese, with 51 corporations, have invested heavily in 78 projects in mining, in copper, in iron, resources, energy, etc. So there is a qualitative difference between selling consumer goods and pharmaceuticals and getting hold of concessions that represent the wealth of a country. So there is not an awareness of this in the US. And in Peru, they say, well, the US has been sleeping. I don't think so. The US is a free economy, so the CEO of a company can say the price is not adequate, I will not make the investment. But we have to find a way in which the US can search and invest in areas that are interesting for American private investors. And that is the effort that has to be made.
Ambassador De Sela, you made some, I think, some important comments about Chinese investment in the region. There has been a push, as has been mentioned, on this transcontinental rail corridor that could potentially strengthen Latin America Chinese trade, but perhaps could also strengthen trade within the region. I would just love to get your perspective on that and the larger sovereignty issue. Again, very quickly, since we're running out of time.
Yes, of course, with pleasure. One thing to begin with, this is a long-term project. We are in the beginning of a long process. What happened between China and Brazil is a conversation in which they decided to hire a company to make a feasibility study. So we do not know if that train is possible in the Brazilian territory. So the position of Peru is to wait to see what happens, if that is possible. I think it's premature to do something in Peru because we are not in a position of making a huge investment like the one needed to develop that train in the Peruvian territory, because we are talking at least $40 billion. $40 billion is a lot of money, and I don't think the Peruvian government is in a position of doing that, and I have not heard of any private interest in doing that. So I would say that we have to be in a position of waiting to see what happens before we get into that process. In second term, sovereignty, I would say that Peru is a country that is in a position of making sovereign decisions. We are not subordinated to any country, and we are capable of making our own decisions without any undue interference. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark, I want to go to you to sort of wrap up this discussion. We have covered a lot of ground here, from Peru's strategic posture vis-a-vis the region and the Pacific, to economic opportunities arising from Peru's situation. Can you sort of wrap this up for us, as it relates to U.S. policy and how Washington looks at Peru?
Absolutely, Daniel. I see that Diego de la Torre had his hand up, though, and I don't know if there's time for him to...
Yeah, just 15 seconds. One issue that also is very important is the cultural penetration of China in universities and the Confucius Institute. They are actually investing heavily in this kind of soft power, which is, well, it's okay. Well, but for example, they are bringing students to visit Huawei. No, I mean, a lot of students to visit Huawei, and all the issues of AI are very strategic. And I would say, I understand the English language is predominant in the language of computing and AI, but also Spanish. And I would say if we align our the code or the softwares of algorithms in Spanish and English, it's better that the Spanish-speaking people align with, I would say, a Western design algorithm instead of a Chinese one. I don't know. That's a instinctive way to put it, no? And they're really trying, not only, I think that kind of soft power should not be underestimated, and they are moving very quietly in a very clever strategic way as well. I would say we should not neglect not only the economy, investment, minerals, but also the cultural issues as well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I think soft power is a very generous way of looking at it. I would call it sharp power. Certainly something we're paying attention to here. But I want to turn it over to Mark for the wrap up.
Sure, Daniel. And I think that that instinct that Diego reflected is very broadly held in Peru, which is, I would say, a very strongly pro-American country. When Peruvians travel abroad, it's frequently to the United States. When they invest abroad, it's frequently in real estate or in businesses in the United States. When they send their children to study abroad, it's frequently to the United States. And so these are two countries that are connected in many ways, not just the commercial, not just through investment. And the U.S., I should point out, is the second largest or the first largest investor in Peru in terms of formal economy jobs created. But it goes far beyond that. There are familial ties and deep historical and cultural ties. I mean, Peru is squarely part of the West. We share a common inheritance. Both countries are republics and share a common Republican history. I've heard a number of things today from my friends. Most of them I agree with. Some things I disagree with, but that's part of living in democracy. I would say that it's clear why Peru matters, why Peru is important for the U.S. private sector, why it's important not for diplomats in Foggy Bottom or in our embassy in Lima, but why it's important for the average U.S. citizen. Now, the challenge that our strategists like Secretary Rubio have today is that we're in a context of severely limited funding for international affairs. And it's perhaps analogous to a post-Vietnam moment when our citizens after Afghanistan, after Iraq, there's not a great deal of appetite for international engagement. So I think that, however, somebody like Secretary of State Rubio, somebody like President Trump, do have an opportunity to transmit why investing in our own hemisphere and strengthening ties in our own hemisphere. This isn't charity. It's not aid. It's about, as Secretary Rubio has pointed out himself, strengthening the United States. And that's what our foreign policy should be guided by. It's not charitable exercises to help Peru only. It's really about helping U.S. citizens. And I think that in that context and looking at it through that lens, our Peruvian friends can do a lot to help. Like Foreign Minister Tudela pointed out, U.S. companies invest where it improves their bottom line. I mean, they don't respond to a suggestion by the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Commerce or the President to invest in a country. At the end of the day, they have to report back to their shareholders in their annual meetings. So there are many things that Peru can do to make this economy more competitive and more attractive. I mean, it used to have only a few barriers, bureaucratic barriers, to open up and invest in mining, for example. Now the number has multiplied, making it much more difficult for and burdensome for U.S. companies, less competitive for U.S. companies to want to come and invest. There are other areas in which our friends in Peru can do a great deal more. Let me give you a dose of strategic realism. U.S. foreign policy doesn't tend to reward neutrality. It rewards alignment. There are ways in which Peru can become more aligned, and the ambassador correctly pointed out Peru's desire to strengthen military cooperation, and in particular in the area of a fighter plane cooperation and integration of equipment and systems. As far as I understand, the United States is very eager to do that. Not only, by the way, because it's a way of strengthening long-standing ties, but also because we possess, the best fighters that are the only ones I think that have been successfully tested in wartime, but that are being currently analyzed. But these are ways in which Peru can help the United States show and demonstrate alignment. I would say, ironically, the more a country feels like, I'm not saying this is the case of Peru, but the more a country feels the need to exclaim that it is strategic, that's inversely proportional with the strategic value that it has. Strategic value doesn't come from the proclamations. It comes from years of patient, disciplined alignment. And you can see it on a global stage when other countries begin to make decisions taking into account what you are deciding to do. That's the point in which Peru sits right now. That's the threshold. That's the hinge. That's the opportunity. That's why it's a strategic moment, not only for Peruvians, but also for externally, for Peru to assume a leadership role within the hemisphere and to further align with the United States. And I think that it was a very aptly entitled panel, and I think that there's a shared responsibility. Certainly, we can do more on the United States side. We can mobilize our instruments, our carrots, so to speak, DFC and other financing mechanisms, the Exim Bank and so forth, to de-risk investment opportunities in Peru. But there are also things that our Peruvian friends and allies can do, and we should also work together, to help them to achieve those goals. So anyway, I think that again, that's I guess perhaps my main takeaway is that it's a shared responsibility. There's a lot that can be done together. I agree in essence with the focus that our friends on our Peruvian friends in the panel have shared, and there are things I think that Peru can do concretely that'll help. And I think that if that takes place, that they'll find strong allies in the United States that will be very happy to participate in Peru's strategic evolution.
Thank you, Mark. I want to end on that note, on your reminder of the need for shared responsibility in the U.S.-Peru relationship. I want to thank you, Mark, for your comments. Diego de la Torre and Ambassador de Sela, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. I hope this has been informative. We'll see you next time.